to welcome everybody to today's program. This is part of the Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival that the library sponsors each fall. And today's program is a discussion of the 2005 One Community, One Book selection, When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka. Each year, the One Community, One Book title is related to human rights themes. And this year, for the first time since the program began, the book deals with human rights issues here in the United States. So rather than looking abroad, we're looking here at home to things that we have experienced and that our laws were a part of. When the Emperor Was Divine is a fictional account of one Japanese-American family that was detained during World War II. The portrait of the treatment at the detention center and the fathers at a separate center, as well as their treatment when they returned home, is not a flattering portrait of America in the 1940s, and it also offers food for thought of how our current justice system works. 4 guests have joined us today to offer their insights into the book, and after they've shared their thoughts, we'll have time for question and answers and discussion between all of us. So I'll just take a moment to introduce our panelists, and then we'll begin. They'll go right down the row speaking for a few minutes each, and then open up to all of you. Our first guest is Natasa Durovicova. She was with the International Writing Program, no stranger to us for these panel discussions. Same with Paul Ingram from Prairie Lights Books. They're here to share their insights into the book as literature. Our next guest is Girija Mahajan. She's a graduate student at the University of Iowa in the Education Policy and Leadership Studies program. And she's also a graduate assistant at the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights, where she works with incorporating human rights education into the curriculum. Our final guest today is Mori Costantino, and she was incarcerated along with her family at the Tula Lake, California Detention Center in April 1942. And she left the camp to attend business college in 1943, as did her older brother, also went to college. But her father, mother, other brother and sister remained in the camp until June 1945. Mori then worked with the U.S. occupation of Japan. During that period, she met her husband, and eventually they moved to Iowa City, where she's been living for many years as an active member of the community involved in many civil rights issues. And I'd like to welcome all of you today. Thank you very much for coming to share with us. Natasa.
Oh, you go first? Well, I expected to go last, so I guess projectors backward. I would say I would want to briefly speak about, I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to say that I think that the novel is interesting in that Julie Otsuka has a certain set of challenges, and then she has a set of solutions to those challenges. So I want to briefly talk about the challenges of the novel as she's put it together, and the way in which I see that she has solved it. Now, again, maybe it's reverse order here, that we should have gone from life to fiction, but anyway.
No, I think it's okay.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Well, the most important challenge that I see the novel having, and I think that's also the greatest challenge for discussing the book in this particular context, is that it's a novel it's a fiction that's in the landscape, that moves in the landscape of the memoir. That is, it moves in the landscape of history. And in that sense, it on one hand demands, and is here, we put it on the table because it makes a certain set of ethical questions that it raises, and those are the questions that pertain to human rights. That's the reason why Johnson County reads the same book, always has a human rights component. It's part of our co-sponsoring agency. And so the question is to address a set of ethical issues, but at the same time, she's doing it in a fictional form. And fiction doesn't have the same responsibility to ethics, I think, as memoir and history does. So we have a book here that's on the cusp between being responsible ethically to a certain set of claims, at the same time not using the tools that memoir or history uses, truth claims, factual claims, provable claims, but rather it there switches over into the personal voice. So hovering between those two is a formal problem that she then uses a set of tools to solve. And then a related problem to this is, I think, that she takes, as a fictional writer, she takes up a minor problem in a historical period that's completely overshadowed by the hugeness of the conflict. So what she takes is a kind of a civil rights or selfhood issue in the context of a life and death struggle. And this is a very problematic challenge. I mean, this is a really real challenge to me, as far as I can see it, because she is here to mobilize our attention to a very, very small, delicate, and discrete problem, if you will, against the backdrop canvas of huge life and death issues. I mean, internment camps in the United States resonate against the backdrop of concentration camps in Europe and elsewhere in the world. There is no way in which one cannot be thinking about the internment camps against the backdrop of Auschwitz. So the juxtaposition or the shadow of Auschwitz, I think, and the moment of how Auschwitz falls over the landscape of this particular book. And it raises with it additional problems, so that, for instance, we today no longer speak about, when you think about a similar problem is taking place in Germany right now, where there's a whole new set of literature coming out which has to do with the suffering of the Germans during World War II. I don't know if any of you have looked at New York Times Books supplement this Sunday, but there's a whole new literature coming out about what it meant to suffer in the hand of the Allies during World War II firebombings, the huge epidemic of rapes of German women after World War II. And so the question of who is the victor and who is the victim in that larger struggle is one that continues to be uncontested and continues to be fought over. And of course, the other, in that same way, the unspoken shadow over this book is the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Because that is the symmetrical problem that's will be happening in Japan exactly the same time as we are watching this very delicate personal drama unfold here. So, how does she do this? How does she show us this insignificant against the magnitude of the problems that in fact happen in the historical background? Well, her problem then is to find the right scale, the voice and the scale. And finding the right size of the voice and the right size, right proportion of the problem is going to be everything and she solves it by finding the right tone of voice. So who speaks in this book? How is the book organized? And you can hear, this is like a seminar. So what are the 5, do you remember, the book has 5 chapters. Who speaks in each chapter? Who speaks in chapter 1? The mother, then? The daughter, then? The boy, then? We, some unspoken we, and then the final one?
The father.
The father. So it's like a braiding together of these 5 voices, right? From mother, who describes the moment of perfection, happiness, just on the cusp of destruction. Then we moved on to the daughter, who describes the transition towards something unknown yet. It's not yet quite tragic. And then the son describes the desolation, the nadir, really, the moment of transformation. One woman withdraws into herself. The daughter undergoes, she starts, it's very curious, she matures, she becomes a woman. She abandons him as a sister. Then finally the children return. We return back to the devastated house, the house that was this kind of temple of happiness. Slowly the mother fades in again, and then the father fades in. And at the very end we have the coda of the father's voice, right? The father who speaks in a very peculiar voice, and I think I do want to talk about this. So what we have is an overall shape from happy downward. This is a novel, but it doesn't have the solution at the end. It goes up to down. It really is the form of elegy. And what is an elegy for? What is lost in the novel? That's, to me, the question that we would want to talk about, because obviously, and one of the solutions, I'm going to say this because I thought about this, I've typed it up here, so is that, the family gets destroyed. Why does the family get destroyed? Not materially. The father doesn't lose his life. He doesn't lose a limb. He does not lose his mind. All of these possibilities are shadowed up in the book. I mean, it's not that the book denies other, more serious losses. What is it that's lost in the family? It's the father's standing. The father was a god. The father was a kind of an emperor. And Before the war was when the father was, like the emperor, a kind of a divine character. The house was a kind of a temple to the father's central standing, his golden halo, his flawlessness, his wonderfulness. That is what the children sustained their strength during the conflict, during the years of the conflict. And then at the end, what we see is the devastation of the family because the father's self has been destroyed. Right? The mother, in fact, makes do. The children disappear. They go on like children do. But what we are left with is the destruction and the hollowing out of the male character. And so I think what is interesting is that Otsuka doesn't write us expecting to be sympathetic to the problem of Japan and its self-esteem in the loss of the emperor. But she does write a novel in which she makes us inhabit briefly the world in which there is order and perfection and harmony, which is symbolized in the form of the father, the emperor. And she makes us sympathetic to what it means to lose that world. So she doesn't expect us to kind of see the side of the enemy, as it were, on the other side. But she does show us that we understand the suffering of the boy, and we understand that because all of us have undergone this, whether we are Japanese American or Japanese or anything. Because what is that the story of? It is the story of growing up. It's the story of losing your father, the centrality of your father for a boy child at the cusp of puberty. It is the loss of the paternal authority. And so in some ways, it's this interbreeding of the personal and the historical that I think is the solution to her presenting the validity of the private perspective, even without wanting to in any way, getting us to understand notions of selfhood and individuality involved against the backdrop of a much more complicated and problematic historical canvas. That's what.
Okay. Well, my responses to it are not quite as carefully drawn as yours, and I saw the book rather differently. I saw it, I did not see the father. I saw the father as a central character, but I also saw each member of the family losing dignity in separate ways that people lose dignity. And I saw it as an assault on human dignity. Now, why should we be so worried about human dignity while Jews in Poland are being slaughtered and destroyed? But I think, as you were talking about, her choice, in depicting this little family is to show that a small loss can be a large loss for a family. That family, of course, will never be the same again. That family is gone. That family, the kids, the Americans. I was stricken constantly by the fact that they were always told that we're taking you to these places so that the Americans don't kill you.
Yeah.
And, of course, these were their friends. These were, and they didn't think that these people would kill them. And all of them had lives in a culture was it Berkeley? Yep. Yeah, it was probably a pretty liberal community even then. But suddenly things became different, and in not very much time at all, signs were on the wall. And you must be out. You must be packed. And the incredibly terrifying notion that the father disappears first, and the father disappears perhaps for different reasons, although those reasons never become clear. And I think they don't become clear because I think in many cases, such reasons never became clear. I think people have probably had to use the Freedom of Information Act to find out what happened to their fathers in such time. There's the girl who says that they'll let her hold the jump rope, but they won't let her jump. Now, there is, and the incredible sense of subservience that sort of overtakes them. I was thinking, many Jews after the Holocaust were so frightened that such might happen again that they taught their kids Catholic rituals so that if anybody asks you, say a Hail Mary, say an Our Father. Again, the mother is extraordinarily careful with her children because she does not know what else might be in store, how their lives might be disrupted again. One thing that I liked about the book especially was I have a bias in favor of books that are divided into snapshots. And this book is almost a slideshow rather than a film. You see this happened and that happened and this happened. And the story, if there is really a story, is left for you to put together as the reader. And it reminded me of Harriet Dorr. I don't know if you ever read Stones for Ibarra, a wonderful, wonderful novel about a family going to Mexico and terrible things happening. But I don't even know why I mention it because it's not a human rights book by any means. It's only structurally similar to this book, but the way it is done gives the reader chances to think, and each little section becomes almost a poem, almost a photograph, and it's like, in a way, looking through somebody else's family album, which is also one of my favorite things to do. Somehow it always makes me cry, seeing other people's pictures. I don't know why. And this book had much of that effect on me. And I read it. It's a book that you can read very quickly. And it's a book that if you read the second time, you'll discover that you have missed things because she writes very, she does not waste a word. She does not waste a fact or an image. And you'll find that, oh, I missed that in my first go through. But I think it is a very potent book in many ways. And I think what Natasha talked about really opens it up to me in a different way, too, because I had not been thinking of it in the backdrop of Europe and in the backdrop of the huge war. I had been thinking of it in the backdrop of a small city in America and a single family and what could happen in such a circumstance. And I was very moved by the book, and that's what I got to say.
I'd just like to start by thanking Andrea and the Public Library for organizing this. Can everyone hear me? No. go now? Okay, sorry. I'd just like to start by thanking Andrea and the Iowa City Public Library staff for organizing this discussion group. And I'm not going to speak to the human rights abuses in the book specifically because I think she will do a wonderful job telling her own experiences, but I'm going to talk more generally about human rights education and why the center has, for the last 5-6 years, taken on this project. All Johnson County Reads One Community, One Book is
I have to interject here. You realize how lacking it is because I believe history classes, American history classes in high school did not even include this chapter until in the 70s. I believe that was the case.
I certainly
That-
never heard it. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, excuse me.
Oh, no, go ahead. But what you're saying is exactly right, that there are portions of our history that are oftentimes omitted because we don't feel comfortable about discussing them. And so one of the reasons that this program was started was to start dialogue in human rights issues, not only globally, but as well as within our borders. I think it's really important that this year the book that was selected is about human rights abuses in the United States. Many times we're discussing things in countries that we have no history of, no concept of, and so people can understand this is in the United States, this happened in the last 50 years. So continuing from that, one of the reasons why we're so excited that this book was selected, in addition to the fact that it discusses issues in the United States, is that it's extremely, it's something that anyone between high school and senior citizen status can read. It's a very accessible book, and that's something that's really important as well. When we're discussing human rights abuses, many times you can, if you read reports, things in the newspaper, it doesn't necessarily give you the personal sort of touch that a fiction novel might be able to give you. Finally, this also kind of, in what's going on in current politics with Guantanamo Bay and the camps that we are now putting either U.S. citizens or Iraqi citizens from across the world, detaining them on, in clear violation of the Geneva Convention. So it brings up issues that are going on today. That's one thing that we hope that this discussion group will leave you with, is that this isn't something that just existed in the 1940s. It goes on today, and it goes on within the United States borders. So I'd like to thank you all for coming as well. So.
Just briefly following her statement, the talk of concentrating people again remember the Black Power movement? There was a talk about gathering all the blacks and putting them in the camps. And then there was an outcry of don't repeat the Japanese-American internment. And now nobody's even talking about it, but the picking up of Arab-looking people, Muslim, religion people, is, that lurks always in our culture, and unfortunately it's there. Now, I want to get back to the title of the book. I have to disagree with Natasa, and that is, as grade school children in Sacramento, California, after public school, I had to go to a Japanese school for 2 hours, 5 days a week, to learn about the divinity of the emperor and other cultural goodies, which didn't take much to our parents' chagrin. And so this, that's the beginning. But Natasa, Otsuka is incredible because by her picture you see that she's very young. So she must be 3rd or 4th generation Japanese. I'm 2nd generation. My parents are 1st generation immigrants from Japan. After we all left camp, my generation shut down completely. They were not only ashamed, but they were afraid. And so instead of, I went the other way, of course, because I always do, I became absolutely incensed and energized. And as early as 1945, I was in the civil rights movement. an anti-fundamentalist Christian movement that was beginning to flourish before the McCarthy era. But anyway, much to the chagrin of my, Japanese Americans, they would shun me on the street corners as I'm passing out literature. But, so, where did she get her information? Partly from the Freedom of Information Act, as you said. But she must have interviewed a lot of people and got, internees to get them to talk for her to get this flavor. And I have to say the authenticity of the camp experience is duplicate of our family. We had 2 more members of the family, my older brother and me. But my younger sister and my younger brother and my parents were the unit that she's talking about in this book. And the older ones were not quite as affected because the federal government decided immediately almost that it was a mistake, so they tried to encourage people to move out of camps. Farmers were asked to go harvest the fields, of course, because they needed a lot of food for the war effort and so forth. Students were asked to leave to go resume their education in the East. So my brother and I left. My father was not a farmer, and he says, I'm not going to go out and do something I never did in my life. So he didn't do that. So they stayed. So my father owned a trucking business, and he was just getting started, had bought his first truck in 1940, and he was very proud of the fact that as an immigrant he had gotten that far. And then, boom, we're all taken away. There's one big difference. Their father was taken away on Pearl Harbor night. My father was not, because fortunately, my father was not a leader of any cultural church or social organization. That's who they picked up. Anybody's name who showed up on the roster of Kinjin-Kais and this other things, they were the ones summarily picked up and hauled off, and that description was repeated over and over again. The bathrobe and the slippers, they were not allowed. And the families, total, where is he? What has happened to him? That is very true, because some of the fathers finally joined my friends in camp when their fathers were taken away. My mother was a Japanese school teacher. That's probably one of the reasons I was a big shame to them, because I didn't take to that education, but she was the pillar, as this woman is in the book. She was the one that absorbed the shock and worked around it, and then she kept on protecting her kids and so forth. My brother was incredibly affected. He was pulled out of University of California. He was an honor, scholarship student there in architecture. He had completed his first year and had started his second. He was so absolutely devastated and angry. And then when he tried to get into Eastern school, Harvard, Yale, so forth, they all turned him down, so he had to go to a very minor school, he thought, for architecture. Well, that's enough.
Did he become an architect?
He did. He did.
He did.
And
get to
actually,
there.
he worked for, well, we're very struggling, but he worked for Yamasaki, the architect that designed the 9/11 Twin Towers, yes.
Oh,
And then he was also, after a while, picked up by that's the irony, here we are, jailbirds. He was picked up by the State Department to supervised the building of embassy buildings or renovations of embassy buildings all over the world. And of course, you caught the irony that I, right after the war, when the occupation is starting in Japan, I, was picked up to go to Japan to work as a secretary. But at that time, I was working for the Fair Employment Practices Commission in St. Louis. And the FBI called up my boss to say they needed to interview me to see my suitability to go, abroad. And so they took me in for questioning, and they were asking me a lot of racial questions like, do I turn my money, my salary over to my father? Does my father ask for my, thing? And then what groups do you belong to? This, that, and the other thing. After 3 hours of this, my boss called up and said, why isn't she back? Isn't it just a routine, checkup? And they said, and then he said, put her on the phone. So I got on the phone. Tell me what he's asking you. And when I told him, he said, let me talk to the FBI again. And so he said, this is exactly what fair employment practices is supposed to, not allow. And you're doing that to my secretary, send her back. And so, lots of little, after effects of that thing lingered, and obviously lingers in our society in a broad way now. So anyway, I could say a lot more, but I won't.
How long, can I ask,
I
how long
was-
you were in the camp?
I was in from April of 1942, the same time as his family, until the next year, 1940. My brother left by January by December to start the January term, and I left in February. So I was there almost a year. My family did not leave until the closing of the camps. And there were 13 of them all over, mostly in the
Where was yours?
Tule Lake, California, which became the camp to hold all the troublesome kids and so forth. And so they removed the placid, ones like my family out of there. And the loyalty oath, no, no, yes, yes, are you loyal? Will you renounce your loyalty to the emperor and swear allegiance to the United States? Was in there. And my brother and I discussed it, and we said, we got to sign it if we're going to get out. My father was infuriated. He says, how can they ask citizens to renounce something you never had, which is allegiance to Japan? And why are you signing that? And we said, we have to go out, get out, and that's the only way we can get out. And that was one of our biggest blow-ups with our dad. He was, pure and really was incensed. Oh, by the way, I learned about our Constitution and Bill of Rights, American history class at Tule Lake, California. And that's how I remember learning inside barbed wire fences, gun towers. So anyway, I could say, I don't know what's pertinent to you people, but when I read this novel, I hope people grasp the import of the way she told it was so beautifully that people, she named it girl, boy, mother, so you could relate to, did something like that happen to me, and does it recall something about me? That is the value of her book, that you can do that and then learn a very important part of our history in a very less painful manner than some history books that you read. So,
Any questions from the audience?
I'd like to hear Ms. Durovicova talk some more about the notion of character and how the author has used characters in this book, because one of the first things I noticed was that the characters were indeed not named, which did invite the reader to imagine these characters as types or as many individuals. And yet at the same time, the author, I thought, was so brilliant in using many vivid details, so you could imagine these actually were individual people at the same time. And then the last chapter seemed to me, ostensibly this was the voice of the father, but it was so universal in the way it was put, and that was even less of a character, an individual character for me speaking as the collective. And so I'd like to hear you say some more about how the author used character.
Well, clearly you have given it quite a bit of thought and have quite a lot to say about it. I don't know that I have a all-purpose instant answer. Just as I was reading, I was thinking that she does have a. I was thinking about the technique where you draw by pushing needles through paper, and slowly the contour emerges. They're actually very. They're not psychological character in that sense that they don't go inside. It is always the symptom, the telling symptom that describes. And sometimes you have these moments when the characters really. As it's adding up, the tiles don't stack up level. The tiles occasionally deviate, so that you get these moments when you have to ask yourself, what is this symptomatic of? What is going on inside? And you really don't have access because the author doesn't operate with the omniscient perspective. But I'm just thinking about the interesting way in which the home, the opening chapter describes the home and selects the details that the mother touches and moves through to give us a sense about where the mother's allegiance lie. And we were just talking about this just before we started. In a way, everything in the story hinges on the question of how the characters feel inside, how the parents feel inside. Do they feel Japanese or do they feel American? It is the question of the loyalty. It is, your father is duly outraged at the same time as you couldn't write a novel if the characters were not psychologically complicated. And the only reason why they're complicated is because they're contradictory. And how does she make them be contradictory without going inside and saying, now, on one hand, I felt Japanese, on the other hand, I also, so what you have is the mother moving through the picture of Jesus, the praying, which is not after the fact, it is before the fact.
Right.
So she affiliates herself with Christianity, she affiliates herself with the American Book of Birds, Audubon, right? She's the one who moves that.
Nothing more American.
And the daughter balances on
Yeah.
the head for grace and poise, right? The Gleaners, the Millet Gleaners, the most reproduction. All of these external signs are signs of complete Americanness, and then discreetly at the end of the day, she has rice and pickled plums. I want to ask about those pickled plums there. And she has a swig of plum brandy and pushes it in the bag somewhere. We don't quite know yet, but these are the ways in which she seems to have consciously what we would call the superstructure. All the symbolic acts are American acts, and yet the flavor in her mouth.
I have something to say, Natasha. That's not necessarily American.
All right.
This picture of Japan, of Jesus.
Uh-huh.
My mother, when she got off the boat, was very shortly contacted by the Baptist
Yeah.
church, who offered this immigrant woman English lessons, cooking classes, and other
How
classes.
interesting.
So, being Japanese, she cannot accept anything without returning. So she joined the church. Her heart was not in it. My father never went. He did not feel, he wasn't solicited for that. And but we were forced to go there. And the cooking lessons were disastrous, I must say. But anyway, so that's maybe the reason she has a picture of Jesus, and not because they necessarily embrace Christianity.
That's not what I said. I said that the way in which the character is drawn are these, facets, external symptoms.
Right,
We don't
right,
really know whether she believes or not, although
Yeah.
she does pray later on, right?
Yes, yes, she does.
Yeah. And you were talking about the final chapter, and one time when I was reading it, the second time I thought, this is Julie Otsuka really getting mad. This is the author. She keeps she does not put a whole lot of emotion into each character. These are facts. These are what's happened. They're supposed to make the reader mad. And then at the end, it's like, just in case you don't think this is a serious thing, bam, 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 in that last chapter. And whether it's really coming from the father or from the author, who all of a sudden thinks, maybe I haven't made my point strongly enough. You get a very you get a real anger.
But it's not a rant, it's a lie.
What it's ironic.
Well, right. But
I am the slant-eyed sniper in the trees. I mean, that's ironically spoken.
Right, but when he says at the end, "I'm sorry," in other words, he apologizes at the end without meaning. So it's not a hard. What I'm saying is, at least ironic or at least sarcastic, but not heartfelt. I mean, in other words, it's not pouring out in some ways. It is the double voice of the author. It is the voice of the author.
But I think the irony is an angry irony,
Yeah.
and I.
Three voices in that last chapter, the anger of the author, the ostensible voice of the father, and then this universal voice. And that last chapter to me read a little bit like a poem because it was so restrained. She made these lists of all the people I am, and then periodically there'd be a joke. When I'm a chicken food fixer, and I can tell good poultry when I see it. And then the tone was so restrained, and the last sentence or two is almost like a child. Okay, can I go now? I just thought the last chapter was brilliantly done. And say more about that too. I'd love to hear what people think.
Okay, I had the experience this weekend of somebody who had just read the book and came up with your comment that it was, and this person had been in the European theater during World War II, that this was nothing in comparison to the European experience.
I'm not saying it's not nothing. I'm just saying that I think that when you speak about internment camps in World War II.
Well, that was their comment, that it was nothing, which I could never accept. And if you want to go back to World War II and realize the use of propaganda by the U.S. to denote that the Japanese is totally evil, and we were the white knight, you only have to go to the stacks in the library to relive this. Go and look at Life magazine. We were the good guys. And this was carried through in war films and everything. The
Ugly
Japanese
caricatures.
right. And but then you come up with the ethical question at the end. We were the only country in the world to develop the atomic bomb and drop it on people. And that's how we ended the war. So there are a lot of...
They weren't really people.
Right.
They're,
Right.
if they're colorful, they're not people. So
Right.
you can do that to the, Vietnam, the villages and everything, because they're
Well,
not.
right, and then you come up with the question, why was it only the Japanese that were interned during the war? Why? We were at war with the Germans, why didn't we intern the Germans? We didn't do that.
Well,
Was it because they were
mechanically
white?
too difficult.
Yeah,
They didn't intern Japanese in Hawaii, because if they did, the economy would have, go belly up. So it was that kind of I think, rationale, rather than because we tolerate them more or whatever, But I want to say about that last chapter, this is a compilation of all the discrimination that was taking place prior to the evacuation. The laws, the prohibitive laws, the restrictive laws, segregated schools, everything. If you will look at a compendium of all the racist laws that were passed by this country since the 1780s. The Japanese, for instance, were denied, all Asians were denied citizenship in 1924. My parents were accused of being aliens. Well, they couldn't become citizens because the law prohibited it. My mother wanted to become a citizen, but she couldn't. So what he's describing here in the last are all the things that were happening And the yellow journalism was wild in California, and people succumbed to that sinister person here and so forth. And it was easy to allow that to happen if you were a Californian, because you've been fed all these pictures before the happening in December 7th.
I just, vis-a-vis what Dorothy was saying right now, though, I want to say that this is the strength of the novel, or rather the specificity of the novel, is that it actually, you know, there is at the end of chapter 4, when everybody returns home, we have the recurrent motif of people saying, are you Chinese or Japanese, distinguishing between kinds of yellow, as it were, you know, kinds of race. In other words, the novel doesn't take quite the easy way out and say, all purpose, everybody was. It does target, it hones in on the problematic specifically that has to do with, you know, I mean, it raises the question without ever posing it. It constantly evokes the shadow of the question of the double loyalty, whether it is or not. And this is why I'm trying to say that the idea of the father and the emperor intertwined is the crux, psychological crux of the book, because it doesn't say all purpose, everybody in the United States was, you know, racist, we were all, it doesn't pitch the problem. It doesn't tell the story as a cleft between the bad Americans and the good Japanese, nor the bad Japanese and the good Americans. It doesn't cleave it quite as easily. It does allow for, you know, Elizabeth Roosevelt, no relation to the president, who writes back to him in the camp, you know. It tries to make these little subtle distinctions between when people go this way and when people go that way, when people have the decency to recognize individuality and when they don't have the decency and simply see you as a category. And again, that's the strength of it. That's something the novel can do and has an obligation to do, which a memoir doesn't need to do and doesn't have the obligation to do. So that is, again, the advantage of writing in fictional form. The price you have to pay is that you have to go deep inside.
I was shocked that people had come into their house and taken things.
Why?
Oh, wow.
Why were you shocked?
Americans don't do that. We're nice guys. That's, I was just, I just thought, gee, if I left for some reason, would my neighbors say, oh, what a great CD collection?
Yeah.
And, I just start loading it up. And I wasn't shocked and surprised, but it really was a dark thing to me to read about.
It's a classic trope after the war, people coming home from camps and finding that the silver that they've deposited with their neighbors has been taken away, and the neighbors come back and say, who?
Yeah.
I've seen it. You know,
Yeah,
such
right.
that resonates so much.
When we were renting an apartment, we did not own a house. The Baptist church set up a storage opportunity for us, and whatever few things that we could salvage to save to put in there, we did. Family photos, books, and certain items, that was ransacked and destroyed while we were gone. So what this experience did was to deprive us of all memory, recollection, and mementos from their arrival in early 1900s up to 1945. That was gone, destroyed. So,
Your legacy.
yeah. So when they say, where do you have pictures of yourself? No.
Paul was saying how shocked he was to find that people ransacked homes, and I was shocked when in early 1943 I moved to Southern California as a 12-year-old child, and there were no Japanese people in sight in my high school, which had 2,000 students. No people of Oriental extraction were present. I didn't know that any Japanese people had lived in California until I started to go to UCLA in 1950. And at that time, a few college students who had left the camps because they were allowed to go east to college were beginning to trickle back to UCLA and were in my classes. And I started to talk to these people, and you know, they had lived in Southern California, and they totally erased. It's like, because I was young and hadn't been taught history, although the first course I had in the 8th grade was California history. When I moved there in 1953, no mention of this at all, and it had just happened the year before. A couple of years later, I joined the Civil Liberties Union, began to read their newsletters, and found out that they were still fighting cases, this was in 1953,
Oh, yeah.
through the courts to reclaim property, houses, businesses that had been taken from people who went into the camps. I was just amazed. And I had never read anything like this in the newspapers or seen it in the movies or anything of the sort. I had to read it in the Civil Liberties Union newsletter, which is why I became a lifelong member of the Civil Liberties Union. So, I mean, just the total absence of Japanese people. And how many people must there have been in California, Mori? A lot.
Well, they said a total of 120,000 were all along the coast, up from Washington, Washington, state of Washington, on down to Mexico. So that's,
It's really just eerie. I mean, just
Yeah.
the removal
And
of
the
a
other
whole group
people
of-
weren't talking about them either.
Nobody mentioned to
Nobody-
me that
nobody
this had
mentioned it.
happened.
I want to be sure to mention the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker group. They were the only established religious group that objected to the evacuation and did everything in their power to prevent it, and then brought care packages to the camps. And they sent people in there to teach in the schools and everything. The Quakers were they helped us get out of camp. They established hostels in various cities so that kids who were going to college in Chicago could stay there until they found adequate housing. In New York, Philadelphia. The
in the
Quakers as an established religion that's the only religion I respect, really. Baptists certainly didn't come to our defense.
And the Quaker
Yeah.
is from a Quaker care package that the boy gets the Swiss pocket knife. And I was
Yes.
thinking to myself, man, pocket knife, interesting. And he touches it and it's a kind of a fetish object in his pocket because that gives him
Yeah.
a sense of freedom. Yeah.
Time for one more question? Wondering about, for your younger brother and sister, if their reaction was similar to the young boy who, sort of had this record of things that it might have been his fault, and what might he have done wrong, and, the young children's reaction to why this happened to them, rationalizing.
I don't know. I left camp and I didn't live or see or associate with my family that much because I was by that time working and getting married and stuff, and I was overseas. So, but in the interim years, we never talked about that, and that would be interesting. But one thing you must realize in many teenagers like me, one aspect which I had to admit was I had more freedom in camp than I did back in Sacramento because my father, and the Japanese community where we lived weren't watching me all the time to see what trouble I got into because we were all Japanese in camp. So I had a lot more freedom, and my husband said, be sure to admit that it wasn't a Nazi death camp.
And the book, in fact, says that because
Yeah.
the girl, that's why the story in the camp is told from the boy's perspective, because the boy misses his mom and has nothing and just dry. But the girl seems to have,
Yeah.
She has some
yes.
moments,
she
yeah.
has some moments, right? Or at least she has exactly what you described. It's very interesting
Yeah.
because I was struck also by, that's what I meant by to say that the book has unexpected details, and you're probably right to say
Yeah.
that it was very well researched, that it does refract the experiences. It's not a flat unilateral perspective. There are these moments when you think,
Because there are the women who picked cherries, and they were really glad to be there because They had an easy life next to their cherry picking.
That's right. Something else is said like that about the camp's advantages. And then at the end, the mother goes off and works, and in a way, the story is told from a reverse perspective. It's the women who win on the husbands being absent. It's, what can I say, written from another perspective. This is the reversal of patriarchy. It's the book that says this is the end of patriarchy. End of the emperor, end of the divine father, and end of the family in which the mother is a humble servant. She goes out and she says reluctantly. So if you rotate the book on its axis, 180 degrees, you see that it is the downfall of one kind of a world, and that's its tragedy, and it's for the wrong reasons. But it is the story of modernity also, and that's what makes it, as I said, be an interesting novel, because it's got the contradictions are in there somewhere.
I'd like to thank you very much for coming today and sharing your thoughts, the audience members and panelists. If we could give everyone a round of applause.